As many people know, on May 2nd, Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao will square off in one of the most highly anticipated fights of all time. The thing is, some people think this is the biggest fight of all time, and that simply isn't true. Although it is very likely it will be the biggest fight of all time in terms of revenue or pay-per-view buys, eclipsing the current record set at $150 million from the Mayweather vs. Alvarez bout, it is not the biggest fight of all time in terms of significance. Why is that? Well, first of all, let's understand what a candidate for biggest fight of all time looks like. In my view, there are 5 fights that are viable candidates for being called the biggest fight of all time. They are Brusso vs. Johnson in 1908, Johnson vs. Jeffries in 1910, Joe Louis vs. Max Schmeling 1 and 2 in 1936 and 1938, and finally Ali vs. Frazier in 1971. Now, what made those fights the biggest of all times as far as significance was not just the prestige, fighting prowess, and popularity of the people involved, but the underlying cultural and political significance of the fights. In Brusso vs. Johnson, you have the cultural and political significance of race and racism and whether an African American would be the heavyweight champion of the world for the first time, taking away such a prestigious honor from a white man.
Finally, in the 14th round, as Johnson moved in for the kill, the police stopped the fight to save Burns further humiliation and ordered the movie cameras to stop grinding.
When finally Burns is about to be knocked out, the world is spared the spectacle of a black man knocking out a white man, and the world is denied access to this historical moment because the white supremacy of the universe in 1908 is so demented and extreme. The knockout is stopped and the film is stopped.
With Johnson versus Jeffries, you had the same thing, ramped up tenfold. It was not just about the fight itself, but as much, if not even more, about the cultural significance where the whole nation was paying attention. It is arguable that Johnson versus Jeffries was so huge it had cultural significance around the world.
The fight was back on. It was billed as the battle of the century. But no one could have imagined the passions it would unleash all around the world.
The colored races outnumber the whites, and have hitherto only been kept in subjection by a recognition on their part of physical and mental inferiority. But here we are, the hitherto dominant race, compelled to recognize that an American Negro, the descendant of an emancipated slave, is our acknowledged master of the one great physical sport in which actual personal superiority can ever be authoritatively tested. Does anyone imagine for a moment that Johnson's success is without its political influence? Jeff may smash Johnson when they meet, and by so doing restore us to something like our old position. We shall never quite regain it, because the recollection of our temporary deposition will always remain to inspire the colored peoples with hope. While if, after all, Johnson should smash Jeffries, but the thought is too awful to contemplate. Boxing Magazine.
Louis versus Schmeling, same thing. The cultural and political significance was enormous. You had Louis essentially as a stand-in or representative for and of democracy and freedom, and Schmeling as a representative of fascism and the notion of Aryan superiority. The fight was one of the biggest of all time, not just because the fighters were both in their prime and considered the best in their division, but they were the embodiment of political ideals and represented a political divide. Like Jeffries versus Johnson represented a racial and social divide. This is also why Ali and Frazier won is one of the biggest fights of all time in terms of significance. Ali represented the counterculture and the anti-establishment due to his stance against the Vietnam War, while Frazier was painted as a representative and friend of the conservative elite, and as perhaps a supporter of the war in Vietnam. What also made those fights so significant, even though this is unfortunate, is that all of them were heavyweight bouts, and the heavyweight title was known as the most prestigious in the sporting world for decades. The Mayweather versus Pacquiao fight has none of that. Both Mayweather and Pacquiao are welterweights, not heavyweights, so the fight doesn't have the cachet and associated significance of a heavyweight fight, since heavyweights are the boxing equivalent of being the top of the food chain. Further, the fight is not the biggest fight of all time in terms of significance, since Pacquiao's already been knocked out 3 times, one of those brutally. And Mayweather is as boring as Bernard and Vladimir, and is arguably not even the current #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world anymore. The pound-for-pound best fighter in the world is arguably GGG. When was the last time Mayweather had an exciting fight? I would say the last one was Victor Ortiz in 2011. And even then, Mayweather got an exciting KO only because he cheated via sucker punch. If you discount that due to the cheating dirty tactic, the last exciting fight Mayweather had was probably Ricky Hatton back in 2007. And I'm not even sure about that given all the grappling and ugly wrestling that went on. And of course, the most important reason why this fight is not an epochal fight necessary to make it the biggest fight of all time is because it has no larger cultural or political significance.